Michael Turner thought he knew his wife better than anyone, but one night changed everything. Hidden cameras he secretly installed revealed Lavra in their marital bed, not with one man, not with two, but with three at the same time. That shocking discovery would unravel his sanity, and within days, a crime so brutal would leave 4 people dead and an entire town in disbelief. This is not just a story of infidelity, it is a story of rage, obsession, and a husband pushed far beyond his breaking point. Michael was known in his neighborhood as the quiet, dependable man who never caused any trouble. He carried himself with calm dignity, working long hours as an accountant and keeping his life orderly, almost mechanical in its precision. To those around him, his life seemed ideal. He had a steady career, a comfortable home in a quiet suburb, and a wife who seemed devoted. Lavra was beautiful in a way that made others notice her, with a smile that could soften any room. To outsiders, they looked like the kind of couple that people admired, the kind who seemed to have worked hard and earned their happiness. But appearances can be dangerous illusions, and for Michael, the illusion was about to shatter in ways he could never have imagined. For years, Michael had trusted Lavra without question. He thought her late nights at work were exactly what she said they were. He believed the stories about her helping friends, about errands that dragged longer than expected, about family matters that needed her attention. But as time passed, he started to notice small cracks forming in her explanations. The perfume she wore was stronger when she returned home, her phone was always hidden or face down, and she laughed a little too much at private messages she never shared. These things seemed minor on their own, but they slowly gathered like storm clouds, impossible for him to ignore. Michael was not the kind of man to jump to conclusions. He was methodical, patient, and cautious, but inside him grew a suspicion he could not quiet. The first real sign came one evening when she claimed she was attending a late meeting. Michael, restless from work, decided to surprise her with her favorite coffee and a snack, hoping to brighten her stressful night. But when he reached her office building, it was already closed. He stood in the parking lot for a while, feeling the sting of confusion. He didn't confront her when she came home later, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his. Instead, he stored the memory away, adding it to the growing list of unexplained behaviors. It was the beginning of a shift inside him. The trust that had once defined their marriage began to weaken, replaced by unease and quiet anger. Michael's days grew heavier with doubt. He found himself replaying conversations, examining her tone, studying her words for hidden meanings. The smallest actions became suspicious. When she smiled at her phone, he wondered who was making her so happy. When she claimed she was too tired for him, he wondered who was receiving her energy instead. Each unanswered question became a weight pressing on his chest. At work, he stared blankly at numbers on his computer screen, unable to concentrate. He began driving longer routes home, hoping to catch her in a lie, but she remained careful, leaving no obvious traces. Yet the sense of betrayal lingered, gnawing at him in the silence of their home. It was not just jealousy that tormented him, but humiliation. Michael had built his life around being respected, being steady, being someone others could rely on. The thought of being deceived, of being made into a fool, cut deeper than he could endure. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he needed proof. Without it, he was trapped in limbo, uncertain and powerless. He wanted the truth, no matter how painful, because only then could he decide what to do. So he made a decision that would change the course of his life. One night, when Lavra was asleep, he carefully took her phone from the nightstand. His heart pounded as if he were committing a crime himself. He scrolled through her messages, but she had deleted nearly everything. What remained seemed casual and harmless, but the emptiness told him more than the words did. She was hiding something she didn't want him to see. He placed the phone back, careful not to wake her, but his suspicion had hardened into certainty. He knew now that the life he believed in was already gone, that trust had been broken beyond repair. But certainty did not bring him peace. Instead, it left him restless, consumed by the need to know more. He started arriving home earlier than usual, hoping to catch her off guard. He asked questions casually, testing her answers against what he already suspected. Lavra remained convincing, smiling through every explanation, but the hollowness in her eyes betrayed something she never said aloud. He began to feel like a stranger in his own home, walking through rooms that no longer felt safe, lying beside a woman who no longer felt like his wife. The tension inside Michael built until he reached a breaking point. He realized he could no longer rely on chance or half-truths. He needed undeniable proof, something he could hold in his hands and know beyond all doubt. It was then that he decided to take a step that frightened even himself. He bought a small hidden camera and installed it in their bedroom, tucked carefully where it would not be noticed. He told himself it was not an act of betrayal but a search for justice, a way to protect his own sanity. Each day he checked the footage, his stomach tightening with dread at what he might find. At first there was nothing. Lavra acted as if nothing had changed, moving through her days with ease. Michael began to wonder if he had gone too far, if perhaps his imagination had built lies out of shadows. But deep down he knew better. The silence of the recordings only increased his anxiety, like the stillness before a storm. He found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the moment when the truth would reveal itself. The night finally came when Michael returned home earlier than planned, slipping quietly into the house. Lavra wasn't there. He sat in the living room, staring at the walls, waiting for her return. Hours passed, and when she finally came home, her hair was disheveled, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with something she tried to disguise as exhaustion. Michael said nothing. Instead, he went to the hidden camera the next morning and scrolled through the footage. His heart stopped as the screen revealed what words could never explain. It wasn't just another man in his home. It was three. The image seared itself into his mind, burning away whatever pieces of trust remained. In that moment, the life he had built, the identity he had carried, collapsed. What he saw wasn't just betrayal. It was degradation, humiliation, and destruction of everything he thought he knew about the woman he loved. Michael sat frozen before the screen, his chest heaving, his thoughts spiraling into a darkness he had never known. He knew then that nothing would ever be the same, that the truth he had chased so desperately had finally found him, and it was worse than his darkest suspicions. Laura's secret life had grown far beyond what Michael ever suspected. It hadn't begun as something planned, but once it started, she kept feeding it, weaving layers of deception that even she struggled to control. To the world outside, she was a devoted wife with a steady marriage, but in private, she sought out thrill, attention, and escape with not just one man, but three. Each man provided her with something different, and together they filled a void she claimed Michael no longer could. One was younger, exciting, and reckless, giving her the rush of youth she missed. Another was wealthy, showering her with gifts and expensive dinners, indulging her vanity. The third was familiar and comforting, offering her companionship that felt safe, even if it was forbidden. She juggled them with precision, making sure none of them knew about the others, all while keeping Michael in the dark. It was a dangerous balancing act, and for a long time she managed to keep it hidden. Her lies were simple, but effective. Late meetings, sudden calls from friends, errands that seemed to stretch for hours. Michael had accepted them because he trusted her. But as time passed, her greed for attention made her careless. She laughed too loudly at messages that lit up her phone. She wore new clothes without explanation. She came home late, sometimes with faint marks on her neck she tried to cover with makeup. For any other man, these details might have been excused, but for Michael, who studied every number and pattern in his professional life, the inconsistencies screamed louder than words. He cataloged them in his mind like unsolved equations waiting for the final answer. The hidden camera he planted had been his desperate solution, and it quickly became the tool that tore apart his sanity. The footage revealed more than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't one lover sneaking into his home when he wasn't there. It was three. The sight crushed him in ways that words could barely capture. His marriage bed, the one place he thought belonged only to them, had become a stage for betrayal. Lavra had turned his home into a playground for secrets, and watching it unfold on the screen made Michael's stomach twist. The first time he saw it, he couldn't believe what his eyes showed him. He replayed the footage again and again, his hands trembling, hoping somehow the angle was wrong, the images distorted. But every second confirmed the truth. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had built his life with, had brought multiple men into the space they once shared, laughing and indulging herself while he worked late nights to keep their life stable. It was not just infidelity, it was humiliation. Michael's world began to fracture. He no longer saw Lavra as his wife, but as a stranger who had been wearing a mask for years. He withdrew from her in silence, watching, waiting, gathering every piece of evidence he could find. He searched her phone again, this time with more determination, uncovering fragments of conversations she had overlooked in her attempts to cover her tracks. Some messages were brief and cryptic, but combined with the footage, they painted a picture of her deceit. Dates arranged, jokes exchanged, mentions of gifts. Each message was another stab to his pride. He saved them all, documenting her betrayal with meticulous care, as if building a case against her. At work, his colleagues began to notice his distracted behavior. He snapped at small mistakes, stared into space during meetings, and left the office earlier than usual. At home, he barely spoke, his silence so heavy that Lavra grew uneasy. Yet she never suspected the real reason behind his quietness. She believed her lies still held strong, unaware that Michael had already seen the worst of them. Her arrogance blinded her to the storm building in his heart. Nights became unbearable for Michael. He lay awake beside her, staring into the darkness, replaying the images of her betrayal. The sound of her breathing, once comforting, now felt like an insult. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the words never came. Confrontation seemed too small compared to the scale of what she had done. Divorce, once an option in his mind, now seemed like an easy escape for her, one that would leave him destroyed and humiliated. He began to think in darker ways, imagining scenarios that frightened even him. The anger inside him had transformed into something heavier, colder, like a shadow that followed him everywhere. Still, Michael played his part during the day. He went through motions with robotic precision, making breakfast, leaving for work, answering small questions Lavra asked, pretending nothing had changed, but inside he was preparing. He wasn't planning a conversation or even a confrontation anymore. He was building toward something final, something that would make sure the truth did not go unpunished. He told himself it was justice, that he had been pushed into this corner, that any man in his position would feel the same rage. Whether it was true or not no longer mattered. The thought consumed him. Lavra, meanwhile, continued her reckless behavior. She grew more confident, believing she had her husband under control. She underestimated him completely, blind to the fact that his silence wasn't ignorance but calculation. Her secret meetings grew bolder. Sometimes she didn't even try to hide the perfume on her skin, and her phone never left her side, buzzing late into the night. She thought she was untouchable, shielded by Michael's calm demeanor. But calmness can be dangerous when it hides rage beneath the surface. The footage Michael collected wasn't just proof of infidelity, it was proof of humiliation, degradation, and betrayal on the deepest level. He could not escape it. Each time he watched, he felt his chest tighten, his jaw clench, his fists curl. It became an obsession. He no longer saw Lavra as a partner, but as an enemy who had invaded his life. Every smile she gave him felt fake, every word she spoke felt like a lie. He lived with a stranger, a woman whose double life had destroyed the foundation of their marriage. Michael began to plan carefully. He thought about timing, about evidence, about what would happen when the truth could no longer be denied. He wasn't just preparing to reveal her betrayal, he was preparing for the chaos that would follow. The line between victim and aggressor blurred in his mind. He told himself he had no choice, that fate had cornered him into this path. With each passing day, his obsession grew stronger, and the weight of what he had discovered pressed harder on his chest. He wasn't the same man anymore. The stage was being set without Lavra realizing it. She thought she had mastered her lies, that she was too clever to be caught. But Michael had already seen everything, and his silence was not ignorance. It was the calm before the storm, the waiting moment before something irreversible happened. The truth had been uncovered, and with it came a darkness that would soon consume them both. Michael sat in his office chair staring at the piles of spreadsheets on his desk, but his mind wasn't on numbers anymore. The figures blurred together, meaningless against the storm raging in his thoughts. Every calculation he tried to do dissolved into images of Lavra and the three men he had seen in the footage. It wasn't just betrayal he felt, it was as though his entire identity had been stripped away in one night. He wasn't just a husband who had been cheated on. He was a man mocked, humiliated, and left broken by the woman he trusted most. The more he replayed the video in his head, the deeper his anger burrowed into him. It wasn't enough to simply leave her. Something inside him told him that betrayal on this level required something far greater than walking away. At first, he thought he could manage his pain through proof. He began gathering every piece of evidence he could find, almost like an investigator building a case. He saved copies of the camera footage on hidden drives, terrified that deleting them would erase the only proof of her deception. He dug through her phone with new determination, finding hidden folders and apps she thought he would never discover. Inside were text messages, photos, and secret plans that confirmed everything he feared. She had been lying for months, maybe longer, with more detail and precision than he could have imagined. Each discovery cut him deeper but also hardened him further. The evidence wasn't just to show her, it was to remind himself that he wasn't crazy, that he wasn't inventing the lies in his head. The texts painted a picture that made his stomach turn. Flirtations mixed with promises, details of when she would see them again, mentions of gifts exchanged. It wasn't simply lust. It was something deeper, something intimate. She spoke to them in ways she hadn't spoken to him in years. Reading her words made him feel like an outsider in his own marriage, a bystander to a world where he no longer belonged. He read them again and again until the words burned into his memory. The more he saw, the more his rage grew, until his body trembled with it. At home, his silence became heavier. He barely spoke to Lavra, but she seemed not to notice, assuming he was stressed from work. She continued her lies as though nothing had changed, gliding through the house with the same confidence she always carried. To Michael, every movement she made was unbearable. The way she smiled at her phone, the way she hummed quietly when she thought he wasn't listening, the way she kissed his cheek without meaning it, it all felt like poison. He wanted to scream at her, to confront her with the evidence, to watch her face crumble under the weight of the truth. But he didn't. He stayed quiet, holding it all inside, feeding the fire that was consuming him. Nights became the worst. He would lie in bed beside her, watching her sleep, feeling the rise and fall of her breath. She looked peaceful, innocent even, but he knew what she had done. He would clench his fists beneath the blanket, fighting the urge to wake her and force her to confess. But he didn't want a confession anymore. Words would never be enough to undo what she had destroyed. What haunted him most was not her betrayal, but his powerlessness. He was a man who had lived his entire life in control, and now his control had been taken from him. That was what tormented him the most. As days passed, Michael's mind began to twist into darker places. Divorce seemed weak, like a way out for her rather than punishment. Exposing her to family and friends felt insufficient, a mere scratch compared to the wound she had carved into him. He began to think about consequences that were final, permanent, and undeniable. He told himself it was justice, not revenge. He told himself that no one could endure what he had seen and still walk away. The more he thought about it, the more rational it became in his mind. He began to plan not impulsively, but carefully, methodically, with the same precision he used in his career. He thought about timing. When would she be most vulnerable? He thought about evidence. How could he ensure no one would suspect him until it was too late? He thought about control, how he could reclaim it by orchestrating the moment, when everything she had done would be exposed in blood and finality. These thoughts scared him at first, but soon they became a source of strange comfort. For the first time since he had discovered her betrayal, he felt a sense of purpose. The dual life he now lived mirrored hers. To her, he was still the quiet, dependable husband, perhaps distant but still predictable. To himself, he was a man on the verge of something catastrophic, planning a course of action that would erase the humiliation she had branded into him. He rehearsed in his mind what it would look like, how it would happen, what the end would feel like. These thoughts became his constant companions, replacing the memories of the happy years they once shared. One evening, while Lavra was out again with her fabricated excuse of a work meeting, Michael sat alone in the living room staring at the hidden footage on repeat. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, though he rarely drank, and let the images play over and over. The laughter of the three men, Laura's voice, The way they moved through his home, it all blurred into one unbearable symphony of mockery. He tightened his grip on the glass until it nearly broke in his hand. At that moment, he knew the line had been crossed. There was no going back. From then on, he moved with a chilling calmness. He began checking the locks on doors and windows, not for safety, but to understand how easily people entered and left. He observed Laura's routines with precision, noting the times she left, the hours she returned, the lies she told to cover her tracks. He replayed scenarios in his mind, practicing them silently, committing them to memory until they felt real. He was preparing for something he could never take back, but the thought no longer frightened him. Instead, it gave him a grim kind of relief. He started to distance himself even more, creating space so she would never suspect the storm building beneath his quiet exterior. Lavra noticed his detachment but dismissed it as stress. She never realized that the silence was the final warning before everything collapsed. Michael had already decided what he would do. All that remained was the moment, and he knew when it came, he would not hesitate. By the end of the week, the plan had taken root in his mind so deeply that it felt inevitable. Michael no longer thought of himself as a man betrayed. He thought of himself as a man wronged, a man preparing to reclaim his dignity in the only way he knew left. The betrayal had destroyed his past, but what he intended to do would ensure no one ever mocked him again. The storm inside him was no longer just was destiny, and the countdown to its eruption had already begun. The night of reckoning did not arrive with warning. It slipped quietly into Michael's life, the way betrayal had, without announcement, without mercy. That evening he had left work earlier than usual, his mind heavy but his face composed. He drove home with a calmness that unsettled even him. The streets seemed quieter, the air thicker, as if the world itself was holding its breath. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but there was no hesitation. He knew what he was about to do, and for the first time in weeks, his thoughts were clear. When he pulled into the driveway, the house looked deceptively peaceful. The lights were on upstairs, a faint glow spilling through the curtains. From the outside, it was just another suburban home, neat and ordinary, the kind that concealed secrets no one could imagine. He stepped out of the car, his footsteps deliberate, the key cold in his hand. The moment he opened the front door, silence wrapped around him, thick and suffocating. He knew he wasn't alone, though. He could feel the vibrations of movement upstairs, faint echoes of laughter and muffled voices. His jaw tightened as he realized the truth was unfolding inside his home again, this time while he was there. He moved quietly, his heart pounding but his movements steady. Each step up the staircase felt like climbing toward a place from which there was no return. The sound of furniture shifting, of bodies moving, of stifled noises reached him before he even touched the bedroom door. It was the same scene he had watched on the recordings, but now it was no longer behind a screen. It was real, happening in his presence, in the place where he had once believed in loyalty and love. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, his breath shallow, and then he pushed it open. What he saw froze him, not because it was unexpected, but because it was real in a way the recordings could never capture. Lavra was there, tangled with the three men, their faces flushed, the room filled with a chaos that mocked the life he had built. None of them noticed him at first. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, a silent shadow, his eyes locked on the destruction of his marriage. The rage that had been simmering inside him erupted into something uncontrollable. He no longer felt like himself, he was something darker, a man stripped of reason, consumed only by fury. His hand shot to the heavy object he had carried with him, a blunt tool he had picked up earlier from the hall closet, just in case the moment came. The sound it made as he raised it startled the room into silence. Lavra and the three men froze, their faces pale as they realized he had been standing there the whole time. Panic spread through them, but before anyone could react, Michael surged forward. The first strike came down with a force that shocked even him, the weight of months of humiliation behind it. One of the men stumbled, blood splattering across the sheets. The others scrambled, but the room was too small, the chaos too sudden. Lavra screamed, her voice high and desperate, but her pleas only fueled Michael's fury. He moved with brutal precision, each strike echoing through the house. The men tried to fight back, but they were unprepared for the intensity of his rage. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, the walls bore the marks of their struggle. Neighbors later recalled hearing crashing sounds like thunder contained within four walls, but none dared intervene. To them, it was just another household argument, nothing worth intruding on. But inside, it was a storm of violence unlike anything the quiet neighborhood had ever known. Blood smeared across the floor as the fight grew more desperate. Michael's face was unrecognizable, twisted by fury, his hands trembling with exertion. He no longer distinguished between Lavar and the men. They were all part of the betrayal, all part of the humiliation he had suffered. Each strike was not just against flesh and bone, but against every memory of lies, every night of suspicion, every laugh she had shared with someone else. The room transformed into a nightmare, a scene of carnage that would haunt anyone who saw it. The three men fell one by one, their attempts to escape cut short by Michael's relentless rage. Lavar remained, her body pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with horror. For a moment Michael hesitated, staring at her, seeing not his wife but the architect of his downfall. She had been the one to invite this into their home, to turn their sanctuary into a stage for deceit. In that moment, whatever love had once existed between them dissolved completely. He raised the weapon one final time, and when it came down, the silence that followed was deafening. The aftermath was surreal. Michael stood in the middle of the room, his chest heaving, his hands trembling, the weapon slipping from his grasp. The bodies around him lay motionless, the life drained from them, the betrayal silenced forever. He stared at the scene, his mind numb, unable to process what he had done. The rage that had consumed him was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that left him staggering. He sank onto the floor, his clothes soaked in blood, his eyes staring blankly ahead. Time lost its meaning. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before the flashing red and blue lights pierced the night. The neighbors had finally called after realizing the noise was more than an argument. The police arrived to find Michael sitting on the floor, his body limp, his eyes vacant. The weapon lay beside him, his hands covered in blood. He did not resist when they placed him in handcuffs. He did not speak when they asked what had happened. He sat silently, as if trapped in a world only he could see, a world where betrayal and vengeance had collided in the most brutal way possible. The house, once a symbol of stability, was now a crime scene. Officers moved carefully through the wreckage, their faces grim as they took in the carnage. Photographs were taken, evidence collected, but nothing could fully capture the violence that had erupted in that bedroom. The news spread quickly, turning the quiet street into a spectacle. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering in shock, struggling to reconcile the image of the calm, dependable Michael with the reality of the crime that had taken place inside his home. As Michael was led into the police car, his eyes never lifted from the ground. He felt no relief, no satisfaction, only emptiness. The storm inside him had passed, but it had left nothing behind. The life he once had was gone, replaced by ruin, and though the betrayal had ended, the consequences of his actions were only beginning. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and as the car drove away, the weight of what he had done settled over him like a shroud. The morning after the killings, the town woke up to headlines that stunned them. The quiet, dependable accountant who had lived among them for years was now the center of one of the most violent crimes in their community's history. News crews crowded the neighborhood, their cameras pointed at the modest house wrapped in yellow police tape. Neighbors stood in disbelief, recounting to reporters how Michael had always been polite, reserved, the last person they thought capable of such brutality. The story spread fast, and with every telling the details became darker, more sensational. A husband discovering betrayal, 4 bodies in one room, blood soaking the very foundation of a home once seen as stable and respectable. Inside the police station, Michael sat in silence. He had been cleaned up, though faint stains still lingered on his hands, the marks of what he had done. His expression was blank, his eyes fixed on the wall as if seeing something no one else could. Officers tried to question him, but he said nothing, offering only silence to every attempt. His lack of words frustrated investigators, but it also unsettled them. He did not seem defiant, nor did he appear remorseful. He was simply absent, detached, as though the violence had hollowed him out completely. The investigation pieced together what had happened. The footage from the hidden camera became crucial. not only as evidence of Laura S. affairs but also as the prelude to Michael S. descent into rage. The messages on her phone, the receipts of secret meetings, the evidence of gifts exchanged, all of it painted a clear picture of her betrayal. But it also revealed the calculated way Michael had prepared, the quiet weeks of gathering proof, the cold deliberation before the storm. Prosecutors saw it as premeditation, while some argued it was the breaking point of a man pushed beyond reason. The case was complicated not by what had happened, but by why it had happened. The trial that followed drew enormous attention. Courtrooms were filled with journalists, locals, and curious spectators who wanted to witness the downfall of the man who had seemed so ordinary. The prosecution described him as a monster, a man who had chosen violence when he could have chosen freedom. They painted the crime scene in brutal detail, showing photographs that made the jury recoil, describing the injuries that left no doubt about the rage behind the strikes. They argued that no betrayal could ever justify such savagery, and that Michael's silence after the murder showed not guilt but indifference. The defense took a different path. They painted Michael as a victim, a man whose entire world had been stripped away by deceit. They showed the video evidence, letting the jury watch the humiliating images that had shattered him. They read aloud the messages Laura had exchanged with her lovers, highlighting the intimacy of her betrayal. They argued that he had not acted out of cold calculation but from unbearable humiliation, a sudden eruption after months of torment. To them, it was not murder, but a crime of passion, a desperate act from a man who had been broken by the one person he trusted most. The courtroom was heavy with tension each day. Witnesses testified, neighbors who had heard the chaos, co-workers who noticed Michael's strange behavior, experts who spoke about the psychology of betrayal and rage. Each word added another layer to the story, but none could explain fully the darkness that had taken over Michael that night. The jury listened, torn between sympathy and horror. Throughout it all, Michael remained silent. He never took the stand, never offered an explanation, never defended himself. His lawyers advised him against it, but it was more than legal strategy. Michael seemed uninterested in speaking, as if words no longer mattered. He sat motionless, his face pale, his eyes distant, a man already trapped inside his own mind. The silence became its own kind of testimony, a haunting reminder of the emptiness left after rage had burned everything away. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation, every eye fixed on the jury as they returned. The words fell heavy, guilty on multiple counts of murder. The sentence followed swiftly: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps echoed through the room, though the outcome had been expected. The families of the three men wept quietly, their grief heavy with both sorrow and anger. The town shook its head at the tragedy, a story of love turned into betrayal, betrayal turned into slaughter, and a life destroyed beyond repair. Michael showed no reaction as the sentence was read. He did not flinch, did not lower his head, did not cry. He simply sat there, as he had from the beginning, silent and still. To some, it was the silence of guilt. To others, it was the silence of a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to say. Prison became his new home, a cold and unforgiving place where the days bled into one another. He adapted quickly, not because he thrived, but because he no longer cared. He ate when food was given, slept when the lights went out, moved when guards instructed. He spoke little, keeping to himself, earning a reputation among other inmates as the quiet one, the man with empty eyes. The guards, too, noticed his calmness, a strange contrast to the brutality of his crimes. But beneath the stillness, his mind remained trapped in that bedroom, replaying the night over and over until it was the only reality he knew. The story never faded completely from the public's memory. Documentaries were made, newspapers revisited the case on anniversaries, and armchair experts debated endlessly whether Michael was a monster or a broken man. Some argued that betrayal had driven him mad, that anyone might have snapped under such circumstances. Others said nothing could ever excuse the violence, that his choices proved he was dangerous long before that night. The debate never ended, but for Michael, none of it mattered. He was gone long before the world passed judgment on him. Years slipped by in prison, but time meant little. Michael aged quietly, his hair turning gray, his body slowing down, but his silence never changed. To him, the past and present had fused into one unending loop. He had lost his wife, his home, his dignity, and his freedom, and all that remained was the hollow echo of what had been. The life he once knew had been reduced to a single night of rage, and no sentence could undo it. In the end, the tragedy was larger than just one man's crime. It was the story of betrayal that grew unchecked, of lies that poisoned everything they touched, of a love that had turned into something monstrous. It was a story that haunted everyone who heard it, a reminder of how quickly trust can unravel, how thin the line between love and hatred can be. For Michael, it was the end of everything. For the world watching, it was a nightmare they could not forget.